Good evening, everyone. Welcome. On behalf of KLRU, Austin PBS, and the Lyndon Baines Johnson Presidential Library and Museum, let me welcome you here this evening to a very special night. I'm Bill Stotesbury, the General Manager of KLRU, and there are several things that are going to happen this evening that I'll tell you about. 50 years ago this month, more than 400 black and white Americans risked their lives, and many endured savage beatings and imprisonment for simply traveling together on buses and trains as they journeyed through the Deep South. Deliberately violating the Jim Crow laws, the Freedom Riders met with racism and mob violence along the way, sorely testing their belief in nonviolence. Tonight, we'll screen an excerpt from Freedom Riders, a powerful and compelling new documentary from American experience that tells the harrowing and ultimately very inspirational story of 6 months in 1961 that changed America forever. PBS stations across the country, including KLRU, are privileged to air this remarkable film in the next couple of weeks. Here in Austin, Freedom Riders will air on KLRU on May 16th at 8 p.m. and again on Sunday, May 22nd at 4 p.m. It's a 2-hour film, and it's well worth your investment of time as well as that of your friends and family. As someone who was a child of the 60s, watching this film reminded me of the importance of recognizing history, both to appreciate how far we've come and to make sure we never go back again. And as the father of a teenager, watching it with her gives me an opportunity to reflect on an experience that I hope she never has the opportunity to encounter. We're also particularly excited by the fact that a traveling exhibit that has been developed by the producers of the film opens here at the Johnson Library on May 9th. The exhibit has been traveling through the United States, but we're particularly happy that on the month that marks the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Riders, the exhibit will be here at the library. The PBS series American Experience has partnered with the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History to create this exhibit that tells the story of the 1961 Freedom Rides, including extensive multimedia content, as well as tracking the current status of many of those who participated on the rides across the country. How fitting that it should open here at the LBJ Library 50 years to the month from the historic journeys. So we'll watch about a 30-minute excerpt from Freedom Riders, and then following that screening, we have the opportunity to listen in on a conversation between Mark Updegrove, the director of the LBJ Library and Museum, and Julian Bond. And it's my great pleasure to say a few words about Mr. Bond before we begin the film. Wikipedia, which is my source for many things, I have to admit, said that Julian Bond, see, I'm not alone, am I? Says that Julian Bond is an American social activist and leader in the American civil rights movement, a politician, a professor, and a writer. It didn't say, but it could easily have added that Julian Bond is a true American hero. An American leader in the American civil rights movement, he helped found the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was the first president of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and was elected to both houses of the Georgia legislature, ultimately serving 4 terms in the House and 6 terms in the Senate, before leaving to serve as the chairman of the NAACP from 1998 to 2010. He's been widely honored, but I was fascinated in reading his official biography to learn that in addition to receiving more than 24 honorary degrees, serving on numerous boards, both corporate and nonprofit or educational, he's also widely published, including several books of poetry and a book of his essays. In 2002, he received the prestigious National Freedom Award. He's also been named one of America's top 200 leaders by Time magazine, and in 2008, he was named a living legend by the Library of Congress. And we're extraordinarily privileged to have a living legend here with us this evening to share his personal experiences of this dynamic, difficult, and challenging time in American history. So with that, let's begin the film, watch the film, and then enjoy a conversation between Mark and Mr. Bond. Thank you all very much.
I wish to apply for acceptance as a participant in Corps' Freedom Ride, 1961.
To travel via bus from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans, Louisiana, and to test and challenge segregated
facilities en route. I understand that I should be participating in a nonviolent protest
against racial discrimination, that arrest or personal injury to me might result.
The Freedom Rides of 1961 were a simple but daring plan. The Congress of Racial Equality came up with the idea to put blacks and whites in small groups on commercial buses, and they would deliberately violate the segregation laws of the Deep South.
We were to go through various parts of the South, gradually going deeper and deeper. 6 of us on the Trailways bus and 6 of us on the Greyhound bus, and see whether places were segregated, whether people were being served when they went to get something to eat or buy a ticket or use the restrooms.
One of the major thrusts of the Freedom Ride was to get the movement into the Deep South. Most of the action up to this time had been in the Upper South or in the North. And one of the ideas here was to go into the deepest South. We were hoping that this would start a national movement.
Corps had this set itinerary. They anticipated that this would be a 2-week trip, that it would culminate down in New Orleans with a real celebration on the anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And there's almost an element of naivete attached to it, how easily they thought it would go.
I'm a senior at American Baptist Theological Seminary and hope to graduate in June. I know that an education is important, and I hope to get one. But at this time, human dignity is the most important thing in my life, that justice and freedom might come to the Deep South.
I have no doubt that the Negro basically knows that the best friend he's ever had in the world is a Southern white man.
We talk about it here as separation of the races. Customs and traditions that have been built up over the last 100 years that have proved for the best interests of both the colored and the white people. There's not been one single change.
The colored man knows where he stands. The white man knows where he stands. We have signs saying colored and white. The colored man knows that he is not to enter there.
Well, a nigger's all right in his place, but they've always been behind us, and just tell you the truth, I want them always to stay behind me, because I never have loved a nigger, mister.
You cannot change a way of life overnight. The more they try to force us into doing something, then the worse the reaction will be.
Our colored people will do exactly as they've done. Our white people will do exactly as they've done. Why? Because it's worked out best.
It was all-encompassing, this so-called Southern way of life, and would not allow for any breaks. It was a system that was only as strong, the white Southerners thought, as its weakest link. So you couldn't allow people even to sit together on the front of a bus, something that really shouldn't have threatened anyone, but it did. It threatened their sense of the wholeness, the sanctity of what they saw as an age-old tradition.
Travel in the segregated South for Black people was humiliating. The very fact that there were separate facilities was to say to Black people and white people that Blacks were so subhuman and so inferior that we could not even use public facilities that white people used. The Supreme Court even said that there was no right that a Black person had that white people had to respect.
You didn't know what you were going to encounter. You had night riders, you had hoodlums. You could be antagonized at any point in your journey. So most of the time, it was very, very difficult to plan a trip. And, you know, you always had to meet someone to meet you there because you didn't know what to expect.
We're rolling along the highway. There is merry adventure in every wonderful mile. We're gliding along the byway, light-hearted and free in streamlined style. As we travel over the countryside, there's romance.
My father traveled quite a bit, and he just wanted a cup of coffee to make it to Montgomery. And he had to go around the back of the cafe to get a cup of coffee, and then they told him,
I'm sorry, our management does not allow us to serve niggers in here.
Pushed him out the door.
It's a wonderful, happy feeling, going along the broad highway. There's the open road in view. Every mile there's something new to make your trip a happy, thrilling thing to do.
I grew up in the South, child of good and decent parents. We had women who worked in our household, sometimes surrogate mothers. They were invisible women to me. I can't believe I couldn't see them. I don't know where my head or heart was. I don't know where my parents' heads and hearts were, or my teachers. I never heard it once from the pulpit. We were blind to the reality of racism and afraid, I guess, of change.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
When John Kennedy was elected in November 1960, there was great hope and expectation that things would be better on matters of civil rights. That was a contrast between him and Dwight Eisenhower. He was young and had ideas and talked about the new frontier. But when he gave his inaugural address in January of 1961, he talked about spreading freedom all over the world, to China, to Latin America, to Africa, to everywhere but Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia.
The base of the Democratic Party was the essentially white voting South. The Kennedys had to be careful about antagonizing Southern governors and the whole Southern establishment, which was segregationist.
I was the first governor in the South that publicly endorsed him for president.
I think he's a person who is sympathetic to the problems and conditions in the South. I think he's a man who will work with us down here to help us.
I knew that you couldn't run for president on a segregation ticket. I knew that. But I felt like that if we ever got in a situation where we needed some understanding and some help from the federal government in regard to our problems down here, that I'd get an audience.
The entire nation will be looking at us on election day and will judge the way we feel about the segregation question by the size of the Democratic vote on November the 4th. Let's turn out the largest Democratic vote in the history of the state and show the people of this nation that we're not going to tolerate integration of the races 1 minute.
The Kennedys, when they came into office, were not worried about civil rights. They were worried about the Soviet Union. They were worried about the Cold War. They were worried about the nuclear threat. When civil rights did pop up, they regarded it as a bit of a nuisance, as something that was getting in the way of their agenda.
It became clear that the civil rights leaders had to do something desperate, something dramatic to get the Kennedys' attention. So that was the idea behind the Freedom Rides, to essentially dare the federal government to do what it was supposed to do and see if their constitutional rights will be protected by the Kennedy administration.
I'm James Farmer, National Director of the Congress of Racial Equality, more often known as CORE.
CORE needed to do something to demonstrate that it really deserved to be mentioned in the same sentence with the NAACP or SCLC or Martin Luther King. For James Farmer, this was a way of saying, I need to be brought into the discussions at the national level about how the civil rights campaign was going to be conducted.
Farmer thought among the other benefits of this freedom ride would be added elevation for CORE, because elevation for these groups means everything. It means money, it means support, you get prestige. All that comes with publicity, and I'm sure Farmer was hoping for some publicity.
I do not think we can lose. We cannot lose unless we allow ourselves to be so divided that we lose a sense of direction and common purpose.
The idea of the Freedom Rides is a really radical idea. The idea of going into Mississippi and going into Alabama and challenging segregation so frontally and so aggressively in many ways is something that alarmed not only those who oppose civil rights, but those within the civil rights community.
They thought it was too confrontational, that it was going to backfire. It was going to set the movement back. It was too risky. CORE just didn't have the resources or the skill or the know-how about the inner workings of Jim Crow and racism and how to fight it in the Deep South. And that was very likely that they would get arrested, they might get beaten up, they might even get killed.
May I have a cup of coffee, please?
Now, look, I don't want any niggers in here. I don't...
Nigger, what are you doing in here? Don't you know?
The training that we did in Washington, D.C. prior to the time the writers got on the buses was largely devoted to trying to see how the person is going to react.
Are you with this fella?
Why, yes, we're both interstate bus passengers.
Where are you from?
I'm from the United States.
By using nonviolence, people see the contrast between your dignified, disciplined confrontation of the wrong and then the reaction of violence. No way of confusing that confrontation.
You move?
No, I don't move when I'm in the right.
Well, then we'll
The Freedom Rides, I think, typified one of the standard contradictions within the civil rights movement. On the one hand, it's nonviolent, doesn't hit back when hit. On the other hand, they're really courting violence in order to attract publicity that will forward the cause. And so you have these mixed motives. Let's hope nothing happens, nobody's hurt. On the other hand, suppose something does happen, wouldn't that in an ironic way be good for us?
get out. Move out. This is
People at CORE thought maybe some bad things will happen, but I don't think they imagined anywhere near the kind of level of violence that they'd meet in Anniston and Birmingham and in Montgomery.
It was make-believe, and it did not scare me, perhaps because it was make-believe, and I wasn't sure I'd really have to use all these techniques. With our nonviolent behavior and our goodwill, I thought we could do anything.
Do you expect any trouble?
There is a possibility that we will not be served at some stops. There is a possibility that we might be arrested. This is the only trouble that I anticipate.
I'm taking a trip on the Greyhound bus line. I'm riding the front seat to New Orleans this time. Hallelujah, I'm a-traveling. Hallelujah, ain't it fine? Hallelujah, I'm a-traveling down freedom's main line.
The first day getting on the bus, it was a good feeling. It was a good feeling. We were together, it was comradeship, it was a good cause. And we were going for the movement, you know, we were going for the people.
Boarding that Greyhound bus to travel through the heart of the Deep South, I felt good. I felt happy. I felt liberated. I was like a soldier in a nonviolent army. I was ready.
Hallelujah, I'm a-traveling. Hallelujah, ain't it fine? Hallelujah, I'm a-traveling down freedom's main line.
When the Freedom Riders board those buses in Washington, D.C., those are regularly scheduled buses. They're not chartered, they're not special buses. They have a couple of representatives from the black press, but no national media following them, and they certainly don't have any protection, whether from the police or from the military or anything. I mean, they're going down on their own, on regular buses, and are going to see what happens to them.
I thought white folks were going to pull a fast one on us. They were going to integrate the facilities during the time that we were there. And as soon as we left, they're going to go back to doing business as usual. And in a few cities, that did happen.
The first 2 days of the ride was uneventful. And it basically was a piece of cake. James Peck and I, we realized that, this is not going to be as bad as we thought. If we could do this all the way through, then we will have achieved what we had set out to do.
Well, almost certainly there wouldn't have been Freedom Rides without Irene Morgan. She refused to give up her seat on a bus in Gloucester County, Virginia in July of 1944. She took her case all the way to the Supreme Court, and in Morgan versus Virginia in June of 1946. On paper, at least, the Supreme Court struck down segregation in interstate travel on buses.
But no state in the South obeyed these decisions, so it was as if they'd never happened. The Greyhound Bus Company, the Trailways Bus Company, were able to hide behind the refusal of state law to accommodate to federal law. So despite the fact that you'd had these national rulings, which should have been law every place in the country, they weren't in Alabama, Georgia, Florida, across the South, business as usual.
When we got to Atlanta, there was a little reception for us headed by the Reverend Martin Luther King. And of course, it was a great privilege for all of us to meet him. He was an icon of the movement.
They had hopes not only to meet Dr. King, but maybe he would become a Freedom Rider, that he'd get on those buses with them. But he pulled some of the leaders of the Freedom Ride aside and said, look, I hear some pretty disturbing things from my sources in Alabama. The Alabama Klan is preparing quite a welcome. And furthermore, many people in the movement think what you're doing may do more harm than good. King said, I'm not going to get on the buses with you, and if I were you, I probably wouldn't go into Alabama.
Later that night, Jim Farmer's wife called from Washington to tell him that his father had died, which meant that he was going to have to leave for a few days and leave other people in charge. He was the main man, and losing him was quite a sobering thing.
Jim Peck kind of took over, but the leader was not there to lead, and we would have to lead ourselves. And we were getting into the most dangerous part of the trip.
There were 2 buses leaving Atlanta for Birmingham that Mother's Day morning. 1 Greyhound, 1 Trailways. So 2 groups of Freedom Riders. They left an hour apart. Only 1 made it all the way to Birmingham.
It was such a beautiful day. It was such a quiet feeling that day. It was bright and sunny, the sky was blue, and it was just a beautiful scenery. We didn't have a sense of fear.
These people are going from town to town and getting off the bus and seeking through mixed groups, Negro men and white women, to force themselves into situations which tend to inflame the local people in such a manner as to incense them and enrage them and to provoke them into acts of violence. That's what they are doing.
It was a very disconcerting period. It was as if one civilization was just coming unhinged and was free-floating and taking on water. People in the South felt, I'm being asked to live in a different way. I'm asked to have different attitudes. I'm asked to behave differently. And as I'm being made to do all of these things, there are people who come on the TV in my own living room and tell me that I'm a redneck and I'm a racist and I'm all of these things. And by God, I'd like to, I just like to punch some of them damn agitators right in the face. I gotta hate somebody. I got to hate somebody.
I lived with my family 5 miles out of Anniston on the Birmingham Highway. I was 12 years old at the time. My dad had a grocery store beside the house, and the name of it was Forsyth and Son Grocery. One day he said there were some black agitators, nigger agitators, coming down from the north. He said he and some of his friends had a little surprise party planned for them, and he kind of laughed.
As we entered the city limits of Anniston, we could see the bus station. Looked like at least 200 people were around the bus station, all men.
They were calling us all kind of names, nigger lovers, communists. Come on out and integrate Alabama. We dare you to do this, we dare you to do that.
The men began to come closer and surround the bus completely. They were saying, let's kill these niggers on this bus and these nigger lovers.
The Anniston clan had it all worked out. They had one of their members lie down in front of the bus. They were puncturing tires, they were breaking windows. They wanted to make sure that bus couldn't leave before they could surround it and do whatever they wanted to do.
The bus may have been there for 10 or 15 minutes. To us, it seemed like an hour. Another bus driver was able to ease the bus through the crowd.
At first, there was a feeling of relief because we were getting away there, we thought. But this car that was in front of us kept dodging from side to side to keep the bus from getting by.
I spoke to an innocent passenger who was sitting there and said, I'm sorry I got you into this. And he said, so am I.
Eventually, we heard that sickening sound of tires going flat.
There was a commotion outside, so I walked to the front of the store to see if I could tell what was going on. The bus driver came out, and he went out to look at the tires, and when he realized how flat and hopeless they were, He just walked away from the bus and just left all the passengers to fend for themselves. He just walked away.
We were now in the hands of this mob. It didn't look good for us.
I'm like everyone else on the bus. I'm pretty afraid, okay? That's putting it mildly.
I watched as a man raised his arm above the crowd with a crowbar, and he broke out one of the back windows of the bus.
You could hear him say, throw it in, and asking, where is the gas, where is the gas?
The hand went down, and when it came back up, it had some object in it that he threw into that hole.
And there was immediate flash fire on the bus.
Pretty soon, the whole back of the bus was black. You couldn't even see in front of your face.
So I ran up to the front of the bus, and I tried to open the door. Only thing I could hear is, let's burn them niggers. Let's burn them niggers alive. At that moment, the fuel tank exploded. I heard somebody say, it's gonna go, it's gonna go. And they ran, and that was the only way we could get that door open.
The door burst open and people just spilled out into the yard. They were practically tripping over each other because they were so sick and they needed to get some air.
I can't tell you if I walked off the bus or if I crawled off or someone pulled me off.
When I got off the bus, a man came up to me, and I'm coughing and strangling. He said, boy, you all right? And I nodded my head, and the next thing I knew, I was on the ground. He had hit me with part of a baseball bat.
People were gagging, and they were crawling around on the ground. They were trying to get the smoke out of their chest. It was just an awful, 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 awful scene.
It was horrible. It was like a scene from hell. It was the worst suffering I'd ever heard. Yeah, I heard, water. Please give me water. Oh God, I need water. I walked right out into the middle of that crowd. I picked me out one person. I washed her face. I held her. I gave her water to drink. And as soon as I thought she was gonna be okay, I got up and picked out somebody else.
As I'm getting up off the ground, 4 or 5 guys coming at me again. And this is when I see the highway patrolman. He pulls his gun and he fired in the air. He says, okay, you've had your fun. Let's move back. And that's what stopped it.
Ladies and gentlemen, my friend Bill Stotesbury put his characterization of our guest of honor tonight very aptly. Please join me in welcoming a true American hero, Mr. Julian Bond.
Okay. Thank you. So right here.
Right here.
Good. Thank you.
We are delighted to have you here and honored that you'd be here this evening.
I'm honored to be here, and I remember the last time and only other time I was in this room, President Johnson was standing here, Ms. Johnson, speaking to a group of people gathered to see the unveiling of the Civil Rights Papers at the Johnson Library. It's the only time I ever met him, and it's good to be back.
Well, we're delighted. I was going to talk about that, and I have a little surprise to show you at the end of the program to that end. But I think this was a moving experience for all of us watching that film. But you were closer to the Freedom Rides than all of us. What are your feelings when you watch that film?
Well, I met them when they came through Atlanta. They had a dinner. Genevieve Houghton said a reception. They had a dinner with Dr. King at a black restaurant in Atlanta. And I didn't go to the dinner, but I met many of them as they stopped in Atlanta overnight. And I had no idea of what waited for them. I thought this was dangerous and risky, but I had no idea it was as dangerous, as risky as it could have been, as it turned out to be. So I was fearful for them. Thought they were brave people, probably a little foolish, a little naive, not understanding what danger lied ahead for them. But I was proud of them and glad to have had this little brush with them. Didn't think I'd ever see any of them ever again.
What did you think would happen with the Freedom Rides?
I thought they'd be roughed up, they might be beaten up. But some of them came near death. And at this occasion where the film stopped, had that Alabama state trooper not been there with his pistol and fired in the air, I'm sure something awful would have happened. So I thought something bad would happen to it, but I didn't think it would be as bad as it turned out to be.
What is the significance of the Freedom Rides in the grand scheme of the civil rights movement? This was one plank of the civil rights movement.
It did several things. It took this organization, the Congress of Racial Equality, and took it from obscurity and made it almost on a level with the NAACP, with Dr. King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, my organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It lifted it up. And it put CORE on the left wing of the civil rights movement with my organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, as kind of a counterweight to the relative conservatism of the NAACP and Dr. King's organization. So it gave more strength to my side of the fight. It showed that there were people, white and black, but importantly white, who are willing to risk their lives to advance the cause of human freedom. And it just sent a signal, I think, all over the country. And it sent a message to young people, both black and white, that you can do this. The sit-ins had swept the country, or the South anyway, a year before, in 1960. And now here's another movement coming along, a different kind of movement, but also involving young people. And it said to young people, here's something you can do. So it did all those things together.
You were 21 years old when the Freedom Rides occurred. And you had already been involved with the movement for a while. It was a very heady time. How did you get involved in the movement?
Well, I've told the story so many times. I was in February of 1960, I was going to Morehouse College, and I was sitting in a cafe, a place we used to go between classes or instead of classes. And an older student at Morehouse College, whom I knew slightly, named Lonnie King, came up to me and held up a newspaper. And the headline said, "Greensboro students sit in for third day," and described how these students in Greensboro had had a sit-in demonstration for the third day. And he said, "Have you seen that?" And I said, "Yes, I've seen that." He said, "What do you think about it?" I think it's pretty good. I like it. He said, "Don't you think it ought to happen here in Atlanta where we are?" And before I could say, "What do you mean, we?" He had said, "You take this side of the cafe, I'll take the other side, and we'll call a meeting." And within a couple of minutes, we had gathered a mass of people who said they wanted to do this. And over the next several days, we got more and more and more. And in a couple of weeks, we were having sit-ins in Atlanta.
We saw Martin Luther King in the film. And over 40 years after his death, we've more or less canonized Martin Luther King. But you knew him.
Yeah.
What was he like?
He taught me, and this story I've told more times than the other story. I'm one of the few people in the United States who honestly can say I was a student of Dr. King's. There are a lot of people who say that, but they're lying. I am the only person who sat in the classroom where Dr. King was the teacher. Only 8 people have that experience, and I'm one of the 8. I took a class at Morehouse College, a survey course in philosophy that he co-taught with the man who had taught him philosophy when he had been a Morehouse student. And so I knew him a little better than many people knew him. I can't say we were intimate friends or anything like that, but I do remember one day, class was over, and he and I were walking across the beautiful Morehouse College campus, and I said to him, I said, Doc, his friends called him Doc, I said, Doc, how you doing? And he said, Julian, I'm not doing well. He said, unemployment is high, racism is everywhere, segregation seems to be movable. He said, I feel awful. I have a nightmare. I said, no, Doc, don't say that. Turn that around. Try I have a dream. And, well. Now, I have to say quickly, that's not true. I made most of that up. And I've said it so often, I was being introduced someplace, and the guy read my biography, and he said, and now, the man who taught Martin Luther King to say, I have a dream. So.
Your secret's safe with us.
Okay.
What would Martin Luther King think of our world today?
Well, I think there's things about our world that he'd be tremendously pleased about. He'd love the idea that Barack Obama is president of the United States. I think he'd consider that a validation of the work that he had done and was doing when he died. I think he would be pleased to know that people of color appear in places they didn't dream of during his time, and that this is a very different and a better country now than it was when he was alive. I think he'd be dissatisfied at things not done, at gaps not closed, at differences still apparent. He'd be worried about that, and he'd wonder to himself, why aren't more people doing more things to get rid of these problems? I thought I'd started something or carried something forward. Why hasn't it been carried forward even more? So I think in that sense, he'd be disappointed.
And I'll go back, look forward in a moment. Let me look back to the movement for a moment. And the principles of nonviolence. I would imagine they would be very hard to subscribe to if you see a violent mob coming to you, not being able to defend yourself. How do you teach yourself to be nonviolent when people want to physically harm you?
Well, I think it depends on, or during this period, it depended on where you were in the movement. In Nashville, for example, where John Lewis was in school, they had extensive training in nonviolence, how to protect yourself, how to fall over and so your vital organs are protected, how to ensure that your head, your neck, your eyes could be protected, how to react when somebody's spitting at you. How do you do that? And so the people in Nashville were thought to be the most skilled or schooled in nonviolence. In Atlanta, where I was, we were just told, if somebody hits you, don't hit back, okay? Okay. And that was the extent of the training that I had. And luckily, no one ever hit me, so I didn't have to hit back. I didn't even have to think about hitting back. But I did see examples, at some demonstration or the other, of how effective this thing is. I remember we were picketing a grocery store in Atlanta, and this white guy came up and hit a guy who was close to me. And the guy he hit just stood there, didn't do anything. And I wasn't sure I could have done the same. I'm lucky nobody ever tested me. But the hitter was just paralyzed. He had expected some response, and not getting it could not do anything else, could not move another inch. Just all of his anger, all of his fight was taken out of him like that. And it showed me how powerful this weapon is. And the surprise to me is that so few people use it today. I think it's used in ways we don't really realize today, on picket lines and protests of one kind or another. But I'm surprised it's not more widely used because it is so effective.
Did you expect to succeed to the degree that you did?
I don't know, because you say to the degree that we did, I don't think we knew what the degree we did could be.
Right.
If you had told me that a black man would be president of the United States, I would tell you what I told you up until the Iowa caucuses. No, it'll never happen. It cannot happen. This guy, Barack Obama, seems like a wonderful guy. I'm sure he'd make a great president, be a wonderful president, but it's not going to happen. And it wasn't for me, at any rate, until he won in Iowa, until this overwhelmingly white state said we think he could be our president, that I thought he had a real possibility of doing it. Until then, I thought this was not quite a fool's errand, but it was an errand that wouldn't pay off, it wouldn't happen. Things have happened that I didn't dream would happen by this time. and things that haven't happened that I thought would have happened by this time. So it's kind of a mixed picture.
Let's talk about what hasn't happened that you expected to happen.
Well, I thought more attention would be paid, and I fault my own organization, the NAACP, as well as all the rest for this too. We've not paid enough attention to housing segregation. And housing segregation in this country is at the root of so many other kinds of segregation. It depends on where you go to school. It depends on what kind of job you have or what kind of access you have to what kind of job. And if you live in a segregated section of your town, you're not going to have the opportunity to have the finer things in life. That's just a fact. Right. And we, and by we I mean we in the civil rights movement, haven't paid as much attention to this as we should have. We should have done more. We should have pushed harder. You know, it's against the law to segregate housing in the United States. We don't investigate this. But there are people who do it, but not many, not enough, and not as many places. And as a consequence, we still live in a tremendously segregated world, and that segregation hurts us all.
Yeah. Barack Obama's inauguration was clearly an important milestone in the struggle for civil rights. Some people thought of that as an end point, in a way, and not a beginning point. Have you been pleased with what you've seen since Barack Obama has become
I was
president?
pleased to hear today, and maybe people here don't know it because I arrived here after you did, that the Republicans have said they're not running a candidate in 2012. that it's all over. And instead, Obama's going to just be asked if he'll stay on for another 4 years. There are things he's done I wish he hadn't done. When he apologized for saying that the policeman in Cambridge acted stupidly, I thought he never should have apologized for that because the policeman did act stupidly. He comes across a man who's standing on his porch. He has identification that says he lives in that house, and the policeman arrests him. That was stupid, and Obama was right to say it was stupid and wrong to say he apologized for it. He didn't push as hard as I wanted to do for the public option. In fact, we found out that while we thought public option was a possibility in the health care bill, that a deal had already been made that it would never be part of that. So that's disappointing to find that out. But you know, I'm old enough to have seen many presidents of the United States, and not one of them has done everything I want them to do. And I don't anticipate that one of them is ever going to do what I want them to do. I was a big fan of President Johnson. He did many things I think he shouldn't have done, and didn't do things I think he should have done. So you have to take what you can get. And with Obama, I've got a package I'm so happy to have.
Yeah. There are the divisions in Washington are as deep as I think they've been in my lifetime. Can we heal that divide, in your view?
I don't know. If you have one party that's determined to say no, that if the president determined to oppose the president, whatever it is he proposes to do, even if he comes their way more than I think he ought to, even if he holds out a hand and says, I want to work with you, as long as they're determined to say, no, we can't heal these divides. And these divides are divides caused by the party of no. If one party says no all of the time, then, I mean, how can you can't work, you can't do anything. I served in the Georgia legislature, and we had many, many differences. And this was almost a totally all Democratic legislature when I was there. It's almost all Republican today, but it was almost all Democratic then. And we had divisions, and they were typically urban, suburban, and rural. And many, many differences among us. Many people thought this, and I thought that, and they thought something else, but never anything like this. We learned how to get along with each other. And for most part, we did get along with each other. I live in Washington, and I see the Congress up close. And it's just so heartbreaking to see no. It's everything, that's all the Republicans know how to say. And apparently all they know how to do. And as long as that's true, we're going to have this awful divided government.
So what's at the root of that acrimony?
I think some of it is enmity against Obama because of his race. And I'm not saying the Republican Party is a racist party. But I think there's a little portion of the opposition to him is because he's black. And the idea of being president while black is just, some people just cannot take that. They cannot absorb that. They cannot understand that. I think there's some honest disagreement that he's doing this and they think he want to do that, and that's to be expected in politics. I think there's the feeling that if they say no to everything, they'll get something. And maybe they will. I hope they don't. But maybe they will get something. But it just seems to me the wrong way to go about it.
You and I talked about the birther controversy earlier today. Were you pleased that Obama had released his birth certificate? Do you think he should have done it earlier? What's your view on that?
Well, I don't know if people in the audience watched Chris Matthews the other day. He ran a series of things about what Obama had done in the days leading up to the announcement that bin Laden had been killed. He went to Alabama to commiserate with the victims of the tornado damage. He went to Florida in the expectation he'd participate in the moonshot or whatever it was. He went to the correspondence dinner and was funny as he could possibly be. And he really got it to put Donald Trump like that. And he, all the time, he knew that we had identified the possibility that bin Laden was in this house and that he had made the hard decision not to drop a bomb on the house, which would have taken care of it, but to send American troops in there who risked their lives to see who was in there and risked their lives in finding out who it was. And I just thought, gee, I wonder what he was thinking when he stood up there at that podium at the correspondence dinner, looked out at Donald Trump, and thought to himself, I got something for you, Donald. But I don't know. On the one hand, I'm glad he put out his long-form birth certificate, but I thought, if people can't believe that the other birth certificate was good, why would they believe this is good? And of course, some of them don't believe it's good. We've already heard people say this is a forgery, that's not real, that his father's name is, father's race is listed as African, so it's not valid. Come on. And some people will never believe anything you say about Obama, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah. We look at this film, and it's easy to say that great injustices were done 50 years ago. There's the old saw that it's easier to build a monument than it is a movement. When we look back at this age, 50 years from today, what will we feel the great injustices were of this era?
Of this period?
Of this period.
Of this period. Well, I'll tell you, I have other thoughts first. I see so many people in this film that I know, or I knew at a time. Many of them have passed away. I don't know if you saw James Peck, and you probably couldn't identify James Peck, but James Peck is the guy who took over leadership of the Freedom Rides after James Farmer's father died, and he had to come back to Washington to do it. And James Peck is an interesting guy because he's the only person who went on the 1947 Journey of Reconciliation. That was the first Freedom Ride, and also on the 1961 Freedom Ride. And he should be someone dear to the hearts of many of the women here, because think of that name, Peck. His family owned Peck and Peck. So he was came from a multimillionaire background, and yet he engaged in this kind of activity. And he's typical of the kind of person who went on this trip, people who didn't have to go, who didn't need to go, but who, like Peck, decided, I'm going to throw my lot in with these people. The wrongs done are just enormous, both the physical damage done when people, and later in the film you see beatings and almost near death here in this bus, that if that bus had blown up in a different kind of way, they all would have been killed inside. Or killed standing next to it. The real wrong was just that there had been 2 Supreme Court decisions leading up to this. The Irene Morgan case that was talked about in the film, and a case involving a guy named Bruce Boynton from Selma, who was a Howard University law student and who was arrested in Richmond for sitting in the front of the bus. 2 Supreme Court decisions that said black people can sit anywhere in the bus they want to sit, and yet all these states refused to obey it. That was the real wrong, and that wrong has vanished and gone, and it took these people to make it go away. The Supreme Court couldn't do it, the Congress couldn't do it or wouldn't do it. These people did it, and that's how it happened.
Yeah. There are many who talk about immigration as the new civil rights. What is your view on immigration?
Well, I'm all for immigration, but people say something is the new civil rights every day. Yeah. It's upsetting to me, this is the new civil rights, this is the new. We can't have all these new civil rights, I don't think. I think immigration is an important issue, And we were close to getting to the bottom of it and close to getting to solutions to it. And there was the beginning of some bipartisan feeling about it when 9/11 happened. And somehow that just colored the whole debate and shifted it in the wrong direction. And it's never been able to recover from that. But I can remember talking to people both in organized labor, including those who had been opposed to a more liberal immigration plan, who thought that the infusion of these immigrants hurt organized working people, and who really changed their position, changed their ideas. There are people in the Republican Party who had, like John McCain, who had a good position on immigration, but of course has changed completely, backed away from what he used to believe in. So you can't be hopeful that something good is going to happen with this issue because it's so important, but you'd hope that cooler heads will prevail, but I don't know, I'm not optimistic about it.
What are the steps that we should be taking toward a more productive and healthy immigration policy?
Well, you got to have, the most important thing is a path to citizenship. If you're an immigration, you're living here in the United States, an immigrant, and you're living here in the United States, how do you become a citizen? If you're here illegally, how do you become a citizen? Is the fact that you're here illegally a permanent barrier to your never becoming a citizen? Is there a way around that, a way you can overcome that? This is a thorny problem. I don't have the solution, but there's got to be a solution to it because you have this enormous population of people, 13 million, who are not illegally here, and you cannot push them all out and take them to Mexico and the border and say, here, go away. It just can't be done. You got to find some way to do it, and I don't know what it is, but that's the root of the problem.
You've been a very outspoken proponent of gay rights. What, in your view, should be done on that front?
Well, I think the people who have a religiously based opposition to gay rights, or to gay people is what it really comes down to, have to find out that, this is, I think 13 states have now legislation proposing to eliminate the possibility of Sharia law in the United States, Muslim law in the United States. But then when I see people saying that their religion tells them that two people who love each other cannot get married, that's kind of a Sharia-like thing to me. So we've already got this kind of law encroaching on our public. And we can't have religiously based prejudices deciding what our laws will be. We can't have religiously based ignorance and religiously based prejudice decide how we can behave and how we can behave toward each other. So I think religious people, if you feel that you don't want two men to marry in your church, that's okay with me. It's really not okay with me, but it's okay. But you can't say they can't get married at City Hall. I don't think, or you shouldn't be allowed to say so. And what's happened is that religious people, or some religious people, have said they can't get married in their church and they can't get married in City Hall either. And I don't think we ought to let religion make that decision.
Talk about your feelings about the Middle East and the uprisings that we've seen there. When you see citizens rising up against their governments in the face of oppression, are you optimistic that real reform can come in that?
Oh, I am tremendously. I'm an optimist anyway, against all evidence. I believe good things can happen, and I know from my own life experience that good things have happened. When other people said no, I said yes, and they did happen. And one thing that I think many people don't know about what we've all gone to call the Arab Spring now is earlier last year, well, in 1956, I think, a group called the Fellowship of Reconciliation put out a comic book based on the Montgomery bus boycott. It was a regular comic book, with colored pictures and people and doing this. And it told the story of the Montgomery bus boycott, told the story of Martin Luther King and the use of nonviolence in the Montgomery bus boycott through the eyes of a working class man, black man in Montgomery. And someone translated that comic book into Arabic and distributed hundreds of thousands of copies of it around Egypt. And there's a body of opinion that believes that comic book played a tremendous role in fueling what happened in Egypt, to our great surprise, our great, understanding. How could this happen? And I have to admit, I wondered to myself, how could this happen? This is the last thing I expected to happen, but not only in Egypt and not every other, but many other countries, and it's still going on. And in Egypt, where they've not won what they thought they had won. They're still continuing to press on, and I think they're going to continue to press and press and press until they get at least a semblance of what it was they were fighting for. And that'll be true in these other countries too. No matter how great the repression, no matter how great the oppression, they're going to keep at it. And I'm just tickled to death that they're doing it, and wish we could be more helpful to them than we are. I look at what's happening in Libya. I'm not sure what else the United States can do without stepping on across borders and boundaries that we shouldn't step on. But I wish there was something more we could do to help them.
Yeah. You've seen things in your career that most of us could not possibly imagine. Has there been a high point?
Oh, there have been a lot of high points. When these civil rights bills passed, the 64 Civil Rights Act, the 65 Voting Rights Act, when the Voting Rights Act was extended time and time again. And of course, the Voting Rights Act is under threat right now. The new senator from Kentucky has said that the Civil Rights Acts were wrongly decided. This man is in the Senate of the United States. And you can't believe that any sane person thinks that way, but apparently he does, which must mean. Anyway, and so, you know, these rights are never secure, but when these bills passed, and I was never present for the passage, but watched from afar, it was just a validation of work I had done and other people have done. And, you know, and I see my old friend John Lewis in this video and think what a hero this guy is. You know, what a strong, courageous man this guy is. And there are hundreds like him. You know, I was lucky enough to get back to my hotel room today in time to see the Oprah Winfrey Show, which I have to tell you I don't watch every day. She had over 200 freedom riders on her show, and drawing largely on this documentary, told the story of the freedom riders, but drew from them things that didn't come out in this, at least in the portion of I saw. And I hope you could find some way to go back and capture that program and see it again. And also, make sure you see this. When is it going to be shown?
Later
PBS?
this month, yeah.
Later this month. Watch your newspaper for time and channel on the local PBS station, and send them some money too, because they need it badly. You know, they're under attack.
You talked about the Civil Rights Symposium in this very auditorium. I think we have a visual. Can we see that visual? Well, let's start with the hair.
Those are the big hair days. And frankly, I wish they'd come back.
Well, you wore it well. And you talked about some of the things that were celebrated in this very room at that time, the 64 Civil Rights Act, the 65 Voting Rights Act. And you talked a little bit about your memories of that time. But talk about that experience.
Well, this is sort of a who's who of the civil rights movement was in this room. And we saw a picture upstairs. Vernon Jordan is over here. In the picture, LBJ and Mrs. Johnson are standing here looking out in this crowd, and Vernon Jordan is standing over here. And I looked back in the crowd, and I saw another couple of people I knew. I looked for myself, but I couldn't find myself. And then out of nowhere, down this aisle or that aisle, came Roy Innis, the guy who had taken over the Congress of Racial Equality and turned what had been a respectable integrationist organization into a right-wing black nationalist organization, and changed it almost like this, made it into something very different than it had been. And he came down this aisle railing at President Johnson, who was standing here by himself at this time. And I can't even remember what he was talking about because it seemed like gibberish to me. And railing at President Johnson. And I was amazed. I thought Secret Service men would jump up, but they didn't do that. And President Johnson handled him so well. And as I say, I was a big fan of President Johnson. I opposed him on the war. I thought he was so wrong in that. But in everything else, he was so good. I think in civil rights, he was the best president we've ever had and are likely to have. And he was just a wonderful guy. And I was just so impressed with the way he handled Roy Innis and sort of, in effect, said, sit down and shut up. But he didn't say that. Maybe it was too genteel to say that.
One of the yeah, a lot of people think that LBJ was very genteel. He gets that all the time.
The best story I heard about President Johnson was that somebody asked him, how did you feel when you met the great World War II hero Charles de Gaulle? Weren't you thrilled when you met him? Johnson said, I had my hand up his leg in 5 minutes.
One of the things that you saw at the end of the Civil Rights Symposium in 1972 was that there was a fragmentation of black groups, which was happening increasingly during the late 60s and early 70s, particularly in the wake of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. Is there a unified voice in the African-American community today?
Well, as unified as it's ever been on some things, there's unanimity in Black America that racial discrimination is wrong and that we need to do all we can to eliminate it, and we need to depend on our federal government as well as our state and local governments to do everything they can to make sure that it is eliminated and it goes away. There's unanimity about that. The division is really, I don't think, as great as it seems. There's always been different views. If you take the civil rights movement alone, take the NAACP, the Congress for Race Equality, which really can't be considered a civil rights group anymore, the National Urban League, so let's say the NAACP, the Urban League, Dr. King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee has gone away. So among these three organizations, there's fair unanimity about what they should do, what their program should be, and they don't always agree on solutions, but they all agree on causes. They all agree on what the problem is, and they all agree that something has to be done about it. So the divisions aren't as great. Now, in Black America, generally speaking, if you think about politics, there's almost unanimity among Black Americans in terms of their politics. Most are Democrats, and they aren't Democrats because the Democrats are so great. They're Democrats because the Republicans are so bad. And when you have a choice between something bad and something that's okay, you're going to choose the okay every time. So I don't think there's as much division as you may think. I think there's a higher degree of unanimity. There's never been absolute unanimity with everybody agreeing in the same way, but most people believe, let's go this way, let's try these things, and most people do that.
Yeah. I must tell our audience, Mr. Bond and I share an alma mater. We both went to the same high school in Newtown, Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia, and we went there a few years apart, but I grew up hearing all about Julian Bond, and he's a great hero of mine, and I can tell you this has been a great honor for me and a great honor for this library. Thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you, and thank you all.